Hi there. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's talk by art historian John Walsh. Today's part 3 of a series of 4 talks in which Walsh is discussing the ideas and works of the Dutch painter Piet Mondrian. John Walsh is a renowned independent art historian. He was the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum from 1983 until 2000. After graduating from Yale and getting his PhD from Columbia, John worked as curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and he taught art history at Columbia and Harvard. Since he left the Getty, he's been teaching part-time at Yale and giving public lectures there, like today's lecture. He gave an eye-opening series on Van Gogh here at the Hammer Museum in 2019, and another series on Rembrandt in 2020, and those lectures are available on the Hammer website, and I highly, highly recommend them. Walsh is the author of many articles and catalogs on Dutch paintings of the 17th century and of several books, including Jan Steen, The Drawing Lesson, and the J. Paul Getty Museum and its collections, a museum for the new century. He currently serves on the boards of the Yale University Art Gallery and of the Hammer Museum. Each of John Walsh's 4 talks is focusing on the evolution of Mondrian's ideas and theories from figurative painting to abstraction as they delivered throughout his life. And today's talk will focus on Mondrian's experiments in the 1920s and 30s. Next week, on Sunday, October 29th, Walsh will talk about abstraction and Mondrian's spiritual ambitions for abstract art. All of the past Mondrian talks are available now on the Hammer website, and today's talk will be available there as well in a few days. And after the talk, we'd love for you to join us for coffee, tea, and cookies in the theater lobby where we can continue the discussion. So now, without further ado, please enjoy the wonderful talk by John Walsh.
Thanks, Claudia. In the previous lecture, we had arrived at this point, which is coming right on now, a painting that Mondrian made in Paris at the age of 47, roughly 2/3 of the way through his career. It's as radically austere in format and content as any work of modern art at the time. He'd come a long way through a series of experiments and transformations that we traced in the first 2 lectures. We looked at Mondrian's origins in Holland in the 1890s as a talented landscape painter with a solid academic training who'd made a reputation in the conservative art world of Amsterdam, painting traditional Dutch subjects. He tried out one style after another, symbolism that could be crisp or vague and slightly otherworldly. And for a time here, he practiced a fluent, sort of painterly kind of pre-impressionism. He painted some large, moody and suggestive landscapes with mystical overtones. He made shattering and startling experiments with the bright light and colors of Matisse and the Fauve group in Paris. And during visits to Zeeland in the summers, he tried out compositions and effects of light that had hardly ever been seen before. Cubism drew him to Paris for a couple of years, where he evolved his own kind of cubism, morphing recognizable things, here the form is a tree, in stages, getting flatter, moving towards the abstract. Here it's the sea. Mondrian's extreme translations of the incessant shifting of the waves in attempts to convey it abstractly. Forms became rectangles, floating without gravity. Picture space collapses, and then he decides to use a regular grid to banish any impression of randomness in the composition. We looked at an invention of Mondrian's, a square turned 45 degrees with 2 regular grids superimposed, which produces an experience of space that's disorienting. He experimented with this diamond format, or lozenge format off and on for 25 years. We saw Mondrian in the 1920 return to color and abandon regular grids. The colors are primaries, and the interrelationships of the shapes began to embody what Mondrian called dynamic equilibrium. The forms balanced but not symmetrical and capable of shifting in our imaginations. His confidence grows. He finds that he can do very well with bigger, fewer shapes and more emphatic colors. We had a close look at a couple of paintings that revealed him as an entirely hands-on artist, not a conceptual, not mathematical, but intuitive. He seldom knew when he began just how the finished painting would look, and often he made changes big and small as he worked. We ended the previous lecture with this startling painting on the screen. Mondrian had traveled so far in 5 or 6 years working in Paris that he had the confidence to go to this extreme, reducing a composition to one vertical and one horizontal and a tiny triangle of blue. You might ask, what is going on here? What, if anything, is this suggesting to me? Or maybe better, what might Mondrian have wanted it to suggest for me? This is a painting made to ask questions and raise them. The canvas is all white, 2 lines crossing, making a little triangle filled with blue. The horizontal line is a bit wider than the vertical one, and it's also shorter. So if Mondrian's interested in balance, what is the situation here? Do we sense equilibrium? If we grant that the lines have visual weights, would the structure tip? And if so, what way? I'd say counterclockwise, but it's close. And anyway, isn't that little dark wedge kind of like a chalk preventing rotation? Another question is, when the lines reach the edges and the artists cut them off, where could we imagine them going? With the painting on the left, we don't need to ask. We can see. They go nowhere. They stay inside. He stopped most of the lines before he reached the edge. He's asserting, I think, that the whole structure is contrived, is contained within the painted surface, and the few lines that seem to be leaving are there to correct any assumption that there might be 3-dimensional space and volume in the picture. It's arbitrary. So this ambushing your expectations is not new in art. This confrontation of Mondrian and Degas was made years ago by Meyer Shapiro to show that Mondrian had learned from the Impressionists that modernity consisted partly of surprise. Unexpected croppings, like bad snapshots, displacing of important things, like the reflection of the hat in the mirror, by the unimportant, the back of the mirror masking the face of the saleslady. I think Mondrian is not just serving up playful ambiguities. I think he's not just baffling his conservative spectators. I think he is making us work to discover the situation he paints. 2 similar but opposing things, horizontal and vertical lines, crossing, coexisting. These can be 2 things at once. It can be a self-contained situation, or, if we choose to see it that way, a fragment of some much larger design whose extent we can't calculate. We don't have the melody, in other words, just a few notes. I want to go back for a moment, 7 years, to those first diamond paintings, and this one, where Mondrian began by drawing and painting a regular grid, and then another grid at 45-degree angle, and then he added an assortment of rectangles on top with wider gray lines, and he tinted them yellow and gray. The composition and the colors were a kind of dainty step toward the saturated primary colors he was going to use in this diamond format 5 years later, the colors that he'd adopted for the rectangles. Mondrian moved from one format to another, not in a straight line, but in a back-and-forth series of experiments. There wasn't any pressure from the art market here either, since despite being in exhibitions, Mondrian's sales in the 1920s and early 30s were pretty infrequent, and his prices relatively low. The diamonds, oddly enough, were the first to go to American buyers, by the way. In the 1920s, he made a few rectangular paintings on the model of the one at the right, but in black and white and gray, as you see at the left. And in the following year, the extraordinary painting in the Museum of Modern Art, a white diamond with a gray triangle at the bottom. The lines have different widths, but the inside edges form a perfect square. That form is pushed a little off-center, giving logic for the gray triangle. It puts ballast in the bottom of a slightly tippy boat. I think that works to create balance, that dynamic equilibrium, but I'm not sure that's true for everybody. By 1930, Mondrian was down to just 3 lines of different widths, vaguely structural, with a long horizontal line doing the stabilizing, a kind of cross beam. At the right, the configuration might suggest maybe a stick figure of a dancer at the bar, arms held wide. And the diamond composition at the left is strange, too. It's about 2.5 feet on a side. I want to take just a couple of breaths and look at it together. Three lines, again, all different in width and length. A horizontal line crosses the vertical one at the right, making a tiny triangle. Not blue this time, but white, empty. The composition is the same as the Philadelphia painting, but it's flipped. It's in mirror image. Plus, it has a heavy black vertical at the left. The side view, by the way, shows you again how Mondrian created a kind of step pyramid construction, thrusting the canvas forward, and how the horizontal line at the very bottom of that picture stops at the edge, displaying the fact that the painted composition is only on the surface, only on the canvas. The asymmetry is more explicit, and the whole thing feels more precarious. Speaking of precarious, I have to admit, what do we happen here? Yeah, speaking of precarious, I have to admit that for me, another image keeps coming up when I look at these pictures by Mondrian with balance in mind. The famous tightrope walker and general daredevil Philippe Petit walking on air. He was stabilized by a long horizontal pole whose weight and length provided the inertia that steadied him. He's the very picture of dynamic equilibrium. Here's another surprising bit of geometry and balance. Roughly 20 inches on a side, not including the frame that Mondrian put on it. Let's just look at it now for a minute or so. Well, in the stack at the left, there are blocks of bright yellow and blue with a faintly blue block in between them. At the bottom, a creamy white block lying there next to a small upright black block. It's a kind of audaciously non-symmetrical composition. And it's brought into balance by some subtle devices, mostly by the large pale blue rectangle at the upper right, which we've learned to observe might, in our imaginations, be the corner of a rectangle extending outside the frame. That suggestion, that ambiguity, is part of Mondrian's stock in trade, as you've been hearing and seeing. The big block is not white. It's a sort of pale sky blue. And I've got to confess that I wonder if it was just an arbitrary aesthetic choice for Mondrian that he put the sunny yellow at the top and the deep blue at the bottom and the sky blue above and perhaps beyond. Did he mean to suggest the elements of seascape that he was so enchanted by in Zeeland? Up close, you can see how he painted glossy black lines freehand with great care, making small adjustments here and there. You can see at the very far right that the black bar is infill, painted over white, which is showing through the cracks. And if you see, as you see long horizontal brushstrokes in the smaller blocks, contrasting with the vertical strokes in the big sky blue block at the right. And if you were tall enough, you could look down at the top and see that he's put the canvas into a strip frame so that the painting, again, projects forward, rather than being confined under the edges of a conventional overlapping picture frame. That strip was then glued to a flat backing board, and the whole thing was painted off-white. Here at the right is a variation on that painting, same size, about 20 inches. The strong blue at the bottom left is gone and replaced by a very pale blue block. The yellow is stronger, more saturated, and the lines are thicker. There's less going on with fewer, subtler elements. You can see that the paint surface is wavy and cracked at the upper right, but it's never been flattened by a restorer later on by gluing a lining to the back. That slight irregularity is what you hope to find in a Mondrian. You hope you won't find the painting in a plexiglass box either, which museums feel obliged to use to foil pointers or pokers or environmental protesters. Here's the view from a gallery stool sitting in front of the picture, or from the side, in very good even daylight with just a few stray reflections. The light is a bit too blue at this hour of morning, but it warms up during the day at the expense of some of the cooler tints that Mondrian chose. The problem of seeing Mondrian the way he intended us to, when we're in front of the pictures, is often increased by museum lighting, which varies quite a lot in strength and color. When we're seeing them in photographs, even good digital images, the problem is that studio lighting often irons out the surface textures and the little fix-ups that Mondrian obsessed over, and you get something flat, like a poster. The one at the left was shot in the studio, no doubt for a publication, and cropped to remove Mondrian's frame. It's so evenly lighted that the small deformations can't be seen. It's had a kind of facelift, and the natural character of a 93-year-old handmade object has been lessened. Again, you can see, I think, how important the frame is, gently pushing the picture plane forward. In June 1930, in Paris, Mondrian had a visit from a fellow painter, Hilla Rebay, at the right. She's better known nowadays as the inspiration and the scout and curator for the man whose arm she's on, Simon Guggenheim. Rebay wrote this about Mondrian to a friend. Mondrian hardly paints. He constructs 2 or 4 squares, but he is a wonderful man, very cultivated and impressive. He lives like a monk. Everything is white and empty, except for the red, blue, and yellow painted squares that are spread all over the room of his white studio and bedroom. He also has a small record player with Negro music. He's very poor and is already 58 years old, resembles Kandinsky, but is even better and more alone. Moholy-Nagy loves him and venerates him in his quiet, intense way. I bought one of Mondrian's paintings for myself, for nobody will like it. A white oil painting with 4 irregular lines. I love it, but I bought it in order to keep the wolf from the door of a great, lovable man. And this is the way to hang it. A few years ago, the Tate Gallery reconstructed Mondrian's studio, complete with mock-ups of some of his paintings and furniture, and the famous color patches that Rebay mentions, and that Mondrian stuck to the walls and rotated for inspiration. Hilla Rebay told Mondrian that he ought to let her friend Catherine Dreyer come and visit the studio. She visited, and in fact, she bought 2 of the big diamond paintings, one now in the Museum of Modern Art, and the other the picture you just saw, the diamond in the Yale Gallery. Here's the painting that Hilla Rebay bought for herself and eventually left to the Guggenheim Museum. Mondrian wrote her when he shipped it to her, "I hope that the picture arrives in good shape, but if it does get dirty, you can always clean it with a little water and white soap." The paint is thick enough to withstand that. A few months before, Mondrian had shown Rebay's new painting in an important group show in Paris that included 80 progressive painters and sculptors, including Kandinsky and the Arps and Léger. The group, there at the top left, called itself Circle and Square, later Abstraction Creation. And Mondrian contributed an essay to its periodical. And you can see the blue arrow shows him, pointing to him in the back row. In the photograph below that, you see Mondrian's entries. Hilla Rebay's picture on the top, and below it a small painting of the same year. Small, but important. At times, Mondrian would come up with a composition that challenged him to do it again, a bit differently. That little picture at the lower right has led to more in succession. Here are 2 of them. In both of them, long lines form a cross. In the picture at the right, there are thicker lines, a bigger red rectangle, and some hefty extra support under the crossbar that holds up the red, even a kind of strut to the left edge. A lot of work, a lot of opposing forces, Mondrian would say, to create the balance that you, or at least I, sense in this composition. At the left, the balancing act is all the more deft, even flippant. The horizontal line is a kind of cantilever to support the red block, which is oblong and upright, you could say even more gracefully proportioned. At the far right end of that horizontal, there's blue as a counterweight. In fact, the blue is part of the mini structure that forms the quadrant at the lower right. But the blue disappears at the right edge. Again, when you hear me use words like support and heavy and top and bottom, please keep in mind that, of course, there's no actual gravity here. I mean, Mondrian painted these things flat on a table, facing up, but he was imagining hanging them on the wall, and so he would have given them an inspection on an easel in between bouts of painting. Well, I'm going to put some of these propositions to you to a test of playing a game with them, a kind of game for you, that is. Here are 3 versions of a Mondrian composition. Let's call them A, B, and C. Look at them together for a minute, and then I'm going to show you one at a time, and then all 3 again. Then we're going to vote on which you consider and which you prefer. There's no contest. There's nobody counting except me, and I'll forget the numbers. A. B. C. So which of the 3 do you prefer? I'm going to ask for a show of hands, please. So if you prefer A, would you put up your hand? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if you prefer B, put up your hands. Thank you very much. Oh my God, it's the same number. All right, hands down. And now C. Yes, 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 just maybe a few more. Okay, that's good, I think. Because, yeah, C is the picture in the Museum of Modern Art, which you may know, you C voters, I'm not sure. But in any case, A, as you can tell, is the picture from the Museum of Modern Art flipped, a mirror image. And for B, I just switched red for blue. Yeah. So please don't worry if you got it wrong. I'm going to give you another chance. In fact, I'm going to give it to you right now. Here's another painting by Mondrian. But the thing is, I've rotated it 3 times, but forgotten which way is up. So you look, please, and you let me know. You could ask yourselves, do I feel there's dynamic equilibrium here? Take your time. Okay. If you prefer A, put up your hand, please. Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. B, please. Good. C. And D. A smattering. Right. Right. Well, it is C. Mondrian did something relatively daring here. He made the red in C sit on top, hanging out a bit to the right, over a narrow strip he creates by shifting the big white square with the yellow and the black base strip a little bit away toward the center. The blue and the black blocks are also elevated, supported, so to speak, by a white block, which is only 2 boundaries. The whole thing seems precariously balanced. Definitely a case of dynamic balance, I think. And the big red hanging block suggests that the whole works might rotate. Paradoxically, since the big square is not likely to rotate easily. Well, you may also have been wondering, what about the title Mondrian gave it? Foxtrot, or Foxtrot B. Foxtrot. He was an enthusiastic dancer, but why that step? Well, it's an American import again, like the jazz of the teens and 20s that he loved, but why this particular step? What we need is a dance lesson, and we're going to have one for a moment with Leon and Kim.
Hello and welcome to this Passion for Dancing video. My name is Leon and assisting me is Kim. And today we're going to be teaching you the basic step of the foxtrot. Now this is one of the most social dances out there. You can use it in parties, weddings, and any other social events. Today we're going to cover the most fundamental basic step of the foxtrot. So let's get started. Okay, we're going to do it to my count now. And slow, slow, quick, quick, slow, slow, quick, quick. And let's do another angle. And slow, quick, quick, slow, slow, quick, quick.
So why the foxtrot? It's in the geometry. It has no diagonals. It's all back and forth and sideways, unlike the waltz of Mondrian's parents' generation. All his life, he's been a lover of rhythms and music, structure, syncopation. They are a life-giving invitation for him to get up and move with a woman partner, which he does in his own unconventional ways. The foxtrot dance in the 1920s was a new and different one. Like his own art, it was structured and sensuous in a distanced sort of way. And not incidentally, it has no diagonals. Here's the artist in his studio, age 61, established but not very secure financially, greatly respected by other artists as an uncompromising, committed pioneer of abstraction. He's standing still and proud with a couple of his latest surprises. On the top, hanging at the height he prescribed for diamond compositions, is a new twist. Instead of the black lines we expect, he painted yellow, and not canary yellow or police tape yellow, but a yellow with an ochre cast, giving it a richer and sort of gentler emotional charge. That painting was commissioned by the City Museum in The Hague, the Gemeentemuseum, and paid for by a group of younger artists who wanted to honor Mondrian in the new building. That museum, being constructed to design by Mondrian's older contemporary, Hendrik Peter Berlage, was built and finished in time to house eventually the greatest collection of Mondrian's work anywhere, including the great bulk of his work before 1911. Mondrian was suffering all kinds of chronic health problems, however. Arthritis, arteriosclerosis, frequent flu and other respiratory problems, aggravated by a lifetime of smoking. There were emotional shocks, too, that left him sad and lonely. The death of his friend Theo van Doesburg, a couple of broken romances with younger women, all described, by the way, in Hans Janssen's recent biography of Mondrian, which is full of vivid descriptions of scenes and conversations, some of them even reconstructed, covering his life and work in Paris. The painting with double lines underneath opens up possibilities that Mondrian is going to explore for the next 5 or 6 years. He freed himself from the austere geometries that had made him famous, and he let himself be a lot more adventuresome. The sizes are often bigger, too. with wide open spaces and bigger distances between the colors, and some familiar tricks like the unequal intervals that look regular but aren't, complicating things. Formats became eccentric too, sometimes very tall and narrow, but never ever horizontal, with, again, the color in unexpected places, almost leaving the scene in this case. And Mondrian is not consistent. He's ready and willing to revise and revive intimate scenes and familiar compositional devices. This one is a kind of child of the ABC composition that we played with a few minutes ago, just 18 inches on the side, with a familiar witty bit of business, that luminous little yellow block, a soloist kind of heading off stage, but still essential to the equilibrium of the whole composition. As you've seen, lines multiply, the compositions evolve into the 1930s and create more complex relationships. When the lines are doubled, there are new variables. How wide should they be? How widely separated? The double lines arouse more associations with the real world, too, especially with built structures, girders, beams. Here in the first of these at the left, a golden yellow rectangle is placed on double horizontal lines that's intersected by a long, thinner vertical line all the way to the bottom, where it meets an even thinner black line that functions as a kind of counterweight. In the bigger, more robust composition on the right, the yellow block gets support from the girder-like double line underneath it, while there's a suggestion that the little blue form at the bottom may actually be suspended. Mondrian could use a single color all by itself as a kind of stand-in for an entire spectrum. Sometimes this strikes us as maybe an extreme kind of purism, and sometimes it's witty. I mean, how dare that blue be out there? Where's the dynamic equilibrium here? I think it works because of the elaborate sort of quasi-logical structure of the lines and the empty boxes. They seem just sturdy enough. On the right, the blue box is similar, smaller, bluer, and it's crowded with, or by, vertical lines, as though the blue box had sort of pushed them aside like slats. Hans Janssen, when he was the curator of this picture at the right, wrote about this painting. A number of relationships are at work, planes becoming lines and lines becoming planes, grids sliding over other grids, grids evolving into other grids, grids refusing to become grids. The three closely packed vertical lines on the right are all equally narrow, but in combination with the adjacent white fields of varying widths, they appear to be different in size. The single blue plane, the thing I've been calling a box, works like a life buoy, a beacon, guiding the organization of the entire image. An entire white square in the upper half of the painting, Janssen writes, is a final echo of the neoclassical style with which Mondrian had been preoccupied for so long in the 1920s and early 30s. The difference between it and the works of 10 years earlier is the huge increase in the power and heterogeneity of the composition, and the growth in both the number and direction of viewing points and the rhythmic elements, while the image as a whole remains impenetrably real. My own favorite is this, which you have to go to Venice to see, at the right, the same large size as the Wadsworth painting on the left, but now the lines are thicker, and not all consistently thicker, and they create two zones, vertical and horizontal, that give you a first impression of being superimposed, and then a double take when you see that the main horizontal bisects everything and creates a double line partway through. And in this dizzy arrangement of black and white, a bit of red is permitted to peep up. The painter Max Bill saw this picture in 1938, and he described it as having not only that red bit, but also a tiny gray area at the extreme upper left. When Peggy Guggenheim asked Mondrian 4 or 5 years later to clean the picture, Mondrian did, but he returned it having painted out that green patch. So finicky he was. These alterations went on in the studio all the time, not just before the picture was exhibited, but afterward too. They were part of the artistic process. And Mondrian made those moves intuitively, insisting that his compositions were not calculated, but instinctive. You don't have to go to Venice to see this great painting of the same year. It's at the LA County Museum. It has a ladder-like structure kind of running up the middle, just a bit off center, and two narrow blocks of color, the yellow one hemmed in strictly by lines, the red one doing what we've seen other red ones do before, teasing us by possibly belonging to some larger field of red outside the boundaries of the canvas. We have some unfinished paintings from these years. Here's one of them. We can easily see various lines in charcoal that Mondrian might have chosen to follow and paint over, but didn't, as well as those that he did. Having made the choice you see, he would have given the white and yellow areas more coats of opaque paint, and to have made his charcoal experiments disappear under them. We don't know why he didn't. Maybe that just didn't seem to him a promising enough design. When colored rectangles like this blue one here are crossed by black lines, there's a hint that maybe space, maybe the illusion of space might have crept in. The blue might be behind those bars. This one he entitled Rhythm in Straight Lines, a signal that these intervals are organized in the way time is in music, regular but syncopated, slowed, or accelerated by the musician. Well, in the year that this picture was painted, 1937, life in Europe had become ominous, particularly for advanced artists. Hitler had become chancellor in 1933, then dictator. It was increasingly obvious that Nazi Germany would seize territory soon, even before the invasion of Poland and the annexation of Austria. In Paris, Mondrian heard reports that works of modern art in German museums were being seized by the Nazis because they were ugly or obscene or subversive, or by artists who were Jewish or mistaken for Jewish. This was an official process based on official anti-Semitism and carried out with the state power and efficient record keeping. So-called degenerate art was taken from museum walls and put on show in various cities, most notoriously in Munich in the summer of 1937. There were works by great German expressionist painters and sculptors, and by other European artists whose work German officials could call deviant or impure, or worse, experimental. That was a bad word, suggesting subversive. The exhibition included two paintings by Mondrian. There, on the upper left, paintings that Nazi officials had removed from the museums at Hanover and Essen. In Paris, Mondrian's British artists' friends, Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth, were getting ready to get out of France and return home. For much of 1938, Mondrian prepared to do the same, to move to England and maybe on to New York, which is where he really wanted to end up. He packed up, gave his jazz records to a friend, assembled his studio gear and a couple of dozen unfinished paintings like this one, and carrying a single suitcase, he crossed the Channel. In London, his friends helped him find rooms and a studio in Hampstead. Despite all this turmoil, Mondrian's work got more and more exposure through dealers in England and New York, and his sketchy finances improved thanks to advances from his dealers and collectors. In London, during almost 2 months of the Blitz, conditions were dangerous and sometimes terrifying. He kept on painting and writing. He tried to get friends to pull strings so that he could sail for New York at last. And after the German raids stopped, and after more delays, he was able to get on board the RMS Samaria, a cruise ship converted to a troop carrier, and sail off from Liverpool in a convoy that was threatened by German U-boats, and a voyage that took 11 days, all of which Mondrian reported he spent on deck. Once he had landed, he got help from a young American painter friend, Harry Holtzman, who had arranged for his visit and found him an apartment. He later became Mondrian's executor. And Mondrian had brought paintings with him that he'd begun in Paris and London and reworked many of them. He gave several of them titles that were sort of homage to where he'd been. He called this one the Place de la Concorde. The colors came from the same repertory as before, but now he used them to make short bars of blue and red and yellow, as well as big blocks. The sense of syncopation is stronger, and there's an amplitude and a kind of exuberance that I think everybody senses. Here is Trafalgar Square, 5 feet high, where the excitement is again at the bottom. The black lines are heftier, and the colored lines are little squares. The whole thing has gained in clarity and force. Now, here's my last exercise for the day, a real-life test. Not long after he got to New York, Mondrian found a shortcut for the fussing he had been doing with paint to adjust his compositions, and also a way to test colored lines instead of just black ones. That was commercial colored tape. He could buy it in Mondrian colors. This close-up of an unfinished painting shows you what it looks like. The tape was quick to put on and easy to cut and patch, and when he felt the composition was okay, he could peel it off and paint where the tape had been. So here's that unfinished painting. One more time. The question is, which way is up? A or B? Mondrian died without making that clear. Take a look, and I'll poll you in just a minute. Okay. A, please. A few. Up more. And B, please. Yeah, you win, B. Some of you may remember this case from last year when there was a lot of press coverage when the curator at Düsseldorf went public with her opinion that for the past 80 years the painting had been hanging upside down. It should have been B, she said. She showed a fashion photograph at the right there, taken in the studio after Mondrian's death, and there it is on the easel, in position B. There was a good deal of mockery in the press of art experts, of abstract art too. There was real schadenfreude. But there are a couple of reasons why the curator's conclusion is not so simple and might actually be wrong. The fashion shoot took place 8 months after Mondrian died, and in between, things were moved around in the studio. Which things exactly, we're not sure. What's more, Mondrian himself sometimes put unfinished paintings on the easel upside down to study them. Anyway, the debate between the blinds up faction and the blinds down people goes on and on to the amusement of art world skeptics. There are 2 wonderful last works painted in the past 2 years. before Mondrian died in New York of pneumonia. This one he didn't quite finish, and eventually went to the Kunstmuseum in The Hague, where you can see it. In New York, he was in boogie-woogie country at last, having heard the music in Paris, having collected records, and having often been out dancing in clubs with friends, as you heard in the last lecture. He was hearing boogie-woogie live almost as soon as he got to New York. It was an outlet for Mondrian, but also something he could give theoretical approval to because its method was similar to his own in painting. In Mondrian's words, destruction of melody, which is the destruction of natural appearance, and the construction through the continuous opposition of pure means, dynamic rhythm. I think dynamic rhythm is just what the painting has. There's a beat in the lines now, little squares of different colors, making for a staccato rhythm. Placed in between the lines are bigger squares of yellow and red, some on the beat and some off. In one place at the lower right, the jittery lines meet, and there's an outburst looking like an eccentric checkerboard and sounding in the imagination like a clash of cymbals. Even with the unfinished zones of blank gray, the composition seems to be stable. The painter, Lee Krasner, took Mondrian out to a jazz club in Greenwich Village and told an interviewer, "I'm a fairly good dancer, that is to say, I can follow easily. But the complexity of Mondrian's rhythm was not so simple in any sense. No matter what the music was, Mondrian danced in a staccato manner with his head thrown back. It seems to me his movement was all vertical, up and down," she said, although she conceded, well, maybe I had been too affected by his painting before I met him. Finally, his most famous painting, which he finished just before the previous one. It's calmer and more measured. I think everybody who looks at it and sees and feels the grid of the city, the stop and start and stop and start of traffic lights at the intersections, the pulses that get into your life. Notice that there are reds and yellows here, but no greens. People spend a lot of time in front of this picture, I've noticed. I've eavesdropped and I've heard bits of, "What's your favorite spot?" That kind of conversation. And I've wondered about that myself, the clusters here and there that look like they might secede, some of them, and go off and declare themselves independent paintings on their own. Here's an eyewitness in December 1942, the New York painter and writer and friend of Mondrian's, Charmian van Wiegand, describing him. Mondrian is taking off the tape and painting in these little sections. All the lines have been broken into what now becomes a rich and encrusted ornament that is as glowing and deep as enamels. The rhythm is strange, so dissonant, so extraordinary in its vivacity, without being dramatic or lyrical or monumental. I think there is joy here in this whole composition, and all the more because you see Mondrian's hand at work everywhere. You get involved with seeing little irregularities, tiny slips and fix-ups, finding gnarly edges and a surface wizened in places. He's involved, and you can see it. It has life. That's Mondrian, and that is his gift. In the next lecture, we're going to look again at what Mondrian hoped he could accomplish with painting, and what he did do, and what he chose not to do, and what the consequences were. Thank you very much for your patience, especially with the games today. Thank you.